Well, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Feeling Smarter. My name's Aaron Dunn, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Tim Miller. G'day, Tim. How are you?
Yeah, going pretty well, Aaron. How are you doing?
A little bit weary. We did, of course, have the federal budget last night, and it's fair to say that we have had probably the largest amount of reform that we've seen in our working lives. We know that superannuation over the past decade, so I'm referring back to 2017 and then into 2007, the decade before, we saw significant change. But Tim, in light of the reforms that we saw announced by the Federal Treasurer, SMSFs and superannuation appear to be excluded.
Yeah, and we put all our search tools into use last night, Aaron, and we looked for the word SMSF and we looked for the word superannuation, and it occasionally made an appearance there, but to the more broader extent, a lot of the commentary was around the confirmation of things like the legislative passage of Div 296, the legislative passage of the Listo changes and other things, and so for the newly announced, and obviously a lot of it had been spoken about in the lead up to the federal budget, but in the newly announced measures, whilst we had speculated that there could be some impact for superannuation and specifically for self-managed superannuation funds, it was a pleasant surprise to find a budget that effectively excluded super from what is the most probably significant tax change we've seen in some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think whilst, and you and I really started to see this as we were going through the budget papers, and whilst, as you said, the Control F on superannuation or SMSF was very limited, you could very clearly start to see, however, that a lot of these measures that were announced were actually going to play a role with superannuation more broadly. And maybe we'll start around the changes to the capital gains tax measures, because what this highlighted, and a lot of this was naturally released prior to the budget night, where we know the 50% CGT discount has been removed and replaced in essence with CPI indexation. I think a lot of people were surprised by in essence, the inclusion of pre-20 September 85 arrangements as well with this. But when it came to SMSFs, the discount, as we know, with the 1/3 discount, is in essence going to carry on.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the area that did surprise us a little bit in that regard, is that we were fully prepared to move to an indexation model in our thought processes before the actual announcements last night. Contemplating that we'd been there previously with these sorts of things with regards to 1999 indexation changes and other things, and so to then have it announced and confirmed within the budget papers that CGT. The CGT discount, as they applied to self-managed super funds or superannuation, was not going to be impacted was significant.
Yeah, and ultimately now it does open up opportunities for people to think about, the tax structure where they might hold assets for amounts that have more growth attached to them and so forth. So modelling that is going to become really, really important going forward. And I guess the other part to that, Tim, was around the focus of this budget with residential housing and the fact that we are seeing some specific new rules around the result of not being able to negatively gear residential property unless they are new builds. But again, when we look at the concept of negative gearing and the introduction of the measures around restricting deductibility of the borrowing and stuff to the income that it produces only, again, that information doesn't extend to SMSFs and the way in which we might be using leverage. So through, say, a limited recourse borrowing arrangement. And we know that was something that the government was sort of looking at and trying to understand whether it is a problem or not. But I think also importantly, the fact that the ability to use this in a residential or commercial sense and the continuation, in essence, of as it is again a real positive for the SMSF sector.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think one thing to obviously take into consideration here is, and we spoke about this previously in discussing all of this, and that is that, with self-managed super funds restricted ultimately to a 70% LVR from a borrowing point of view, that the concept necessarily of negative gearing as such is not a prominent strategy from an SMSF point of view, because a big part of the lending process is to ensure that the fund is receiving the income to be able to make its repayments and other things, and so you're not necessarily creating those lost positions. But the fact that LRBAs have been retained and maintained without any changes there, the fact obviously that it's going to mean for a lot of people investing in residential property outside of superannuation is going to be something that they review, unless they're looking at, say, new builds, for example. That it still opens up self-managed super fund as potentially the investment vehicle of choice for investment properties.
Yeah, and I guess the other key element to this was around the use of discretionary trusts. So the government has indicated here a 30% minimum tax on trust income, and obviously we've already spoken about the CGT on trust assets and the exclusions that apply to superannuation funds here, where they obviously are caught as a trust ordinarily. But the thing that I'm most interested here in tying this back to the superannuation conversation is around the Division 296 tax rules, which are starting from the 1st of July 2026, because where we were going to see individuals moving assets from within a in-scope environment, so whether they've got balances that were above 3 million or even 10 million, the fact that we're seeing this minimum tax rate on trust income, again, just moves the needle in the conversations that we're going to be having clients around whether people will be moving assets out of superannuation or not.
Yeah, and look, it'd be nice for us to pretend that Division 296 was the driver behind the discretionary trust changes, but presumably it had nothing to do with it whatsoever. But I think you're right. It's one of those scenarios where I think we looked at Div 296 and said, okay, well, there's a conversation to be had, not necessarily action to be taken, but a conversation to be had about where the best place to hold assets if you have superannuation balances in excess of $3 million, right? And one of those, and the conversation generally fell around three structures: trust, individually, or in a company, right? And clearly, with the CGT rules changing, and the loss of the CGT discount and moving to an indexation factor and a minimum tax rate of 30% on capital gains, on real gains, it then makes trusts and individual holdings a lot less attractive in that regard. And of course, so therefore the thought process of going, well, discretionary trust, where we can split that income to multiple beneficiaries and therefore operate in their marginal tax environment, that had still some significant benefit to it in the thought process. But now to have a fixed tax rate applied there at that 30%, yes, with some tax credit that gets associated to the individual taxpayer, but to have that, it all of a sudden makes that a lot less attractive. And so therefore the conversation piece around where to hold those assets, even in light of Div 296, sort of lends itself towards superannuation, and in our instance, self-managed super, still being viable, if not the ultimate choice in regards to a number of holdings.
Yeah, and I think what is important to note here is that there is some relief that's being provided around CGT rollover, recognising that those that may have investments within trust structures will be able to utilise that relief over a 3-year period commencing from 1 July 2027. So that's obviously federal law. There, certain assets will be then subject to different state-based laws, particularly if we're looking at stamp duties and the like as well. So they're not going to be as straightforward as people might think. But bringing it back to my initial comments, Tim, the realities are, once we start to unpack some of this information further, and we talk to the CGT issues, we talk to the where you might hold property and so forth, it really does lend itself to saying that superannuation again has moved itself up to the top of the perch as arguably the structure, and where we will see a lot of people hold that and consolidate their wealth going forward.
Yeah, without a doubt, and of course, it'd be remiss of us to not look at the flip side of all that as well, and highlight that one of the significant changes, which has previously been legislated anyhow, is obviously the lowering of the marginal tax rate for the lower income brackets, and so those earning less than 45,000. And clearly, with the introduction of the working Australian tax offset, with Listo and other changes there, super will be a benefit still, but from a tax point of view, it's not going to be any more beneficial to have money in super versus outside of super for those low income earners, except in a CGT environment where the only exclusion to the 30% CGT tax rate is going to be for those that are receiving some form of government benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is worth noting that CGT issue, like you said there, where there will be circumstances where we'll be seeing people trying to get some sort of government income support so that 30% cap on CGT ultimately wouldn't apply to them. So you can I guess the devil will be in the detail with some of this stuff, but there are ways and means to sort of work around some of these things, but we won't really know that until we sort of get some more information on this, which is why in a lot of instances we're seeing a lot of these measures look to commence from 1 July 2027, because there still needs to be a significant amount of water go under the bridge as well.
100%.
Well, I think, Tim, we're going to be talking about some of these measures and their impact, I guess, more broadly with SMSFs over the next couple of Feeling Smarters, I think it's fair to say as well. But again, for those of you that are trying to get your head around what these budget changes mean, hopefully we've given you a little bit more insight today, and we'll continue to do so as these rules progress. So, Tim, thanks again.
Always a pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you for our next edition of Feeling Smarter. Take care and bye for now.
See you all.